In this video, we're going to learn how to work with global, local, and block scope of our constants and variables. So let's look at some examples of some global variables. So here I am declaring two global variables, and they're global because they're not declared inside any other function. They're declared outside of all the functions in our code. One of them I'm declaring with the var keyword, which we haven't used much because you should really try to get away from using var. And we're going to discuss a little bit more about why that is. Uh, we have already talked in earlier chapters about hoisting and some of the problems that can happen there. But let's look at these two global variables. So when I say var tax rate and I set it to a value like 0.074, it's a global variable, and because it was declared with var, it actually adds a tax rate property to the window object. Okay, if I declare a variable with let, so in this instance tax equals 0, that doesn't add anything to the window object. Adding things to the window object can be problematic, especially when it comes to naming. If we have multiple functions in our program, maybe you wrote some, maybe one of your partners wrote some, somebody else in your company wrote some. Global objects can have conflicts when they have the same names, and you start accidentally overriding each other's values. So it's better to use let. But since I declared one with var and one with let, let's see what happens when I call alert and I say window.tax rate. It's going to display 0.074 because tax rate got added to the window object when it was declared because we used the var keyword. Let tax equal 0 is a global variable as well, but it doesn't get added to the window object. So if I try to alert with window.tax, it's going to display undefined because it didn't add anything to the window object, and that's a good thing. A lot of recent developments in JavaScript for the past 5 or 6 years at least, maybe longer, are to overcome some initial weaknesses that were designed into the language. And this is one of them. Use let over var anytime you can. So let's look at a function that actually makes use of these two global variables, tax rate and tax. So here I have a function called calculate tax. The function expression, because it has the equal sign. It has one parameter it takes in called subtotal. So we have to pass in an argument to subtotal. And then it's an arrow function that takes the subtotal that gets passed in and multiplies it by the tax rate, which tax rate was declared up here outside of that function, calculates the tax, rounds it to 2 decimal places, and stores it back in this global tax variable. So we can call this calculate tax function and pass it an argument of 100. That 100 gets passed into the subtotal parameter, gets multiplied by the tax rate, which is declared up here, and gets rounded to 2 decimal places. And it ends up displaying, when we say alert tax, displays 7.4. So it used the function, used these two global variables, one of them in the calculation and the other one to store the result, which means outside of this function, we can still get to those. It seems like a good thing on the surface. But again, if somebody else writes some functions or makes some global variables that exist all throughout your code, we can have naming problems. And that's important that we don't do that. So let's take a look at a better way to do this. This is the same function that uses local variables and constants. So this is the calculate tax function, how we've seen it before, and it uses subtotal and tax rate. So subtotal and tax rate, because they're parameters at the function level, they only exist within this function. Okay. So when somebody calls this function, calculate tax, they pass two arguments in, 100 and 0.074, that get stored in these two parameters. We calculate the subtotal times the tax rate that got passed in, put it, set it equal to this tax, and then round it to 2 decimal places, and we return that value. This is a much better way because it limits the scope of these variables. These variables and these constants only exist within this function. They don't exist anywhere else. We pass the value back and we can store it in a variable called tax out here that has no relationship at all to the tax that is inside here. Okay, so these two constants have the same name. This one was declared inside the function and it is separate from this one declared outside the function. Okay, and then we can alert tax here and we don't have any problems at all. Let's look at var and let inside a couple loops down here. In this for loop, we're declaring our counter variable using the var keyword. I equals 0 till while I is less than 5. We're going to increase I by 1 and we're going to execute some block of code. So once our loop executes and my loop is done, if I alert I, it will display 5. Because I declared it with the var keyword, I exists everywhere in this function. Okay, it's not just limited to the for loop where I meant to use it. Let's look at a similar one. The only difference is that I'm declaring our counter variable j with the let keyword. Okay. The loop runs, it counts from 0 to 5. Executes whatever code is in the block of the loop, and then I try to alert J, I get an error. J is not in scope because I use let. Let only exists inside this loop. It has a smaller scope, a limited scope, and that's a good thing. We want a limited scope. We don't want variables and constants taking up a larger code space than they need. So always pick let over var. So we've talked about scope. Scope is the area where a variable or constant exists and can be used in our code. Okay. We talked about global variables and global constants can basically be used anywhere. And that causes problems because we can have naming conflicts between all kinds of different functions and things if we're using global variables and global constants. We talked about local variables and local constants. They are limited to the place where they're declared inside our functions, and that is the best practice. We talked about function scope. If we use let, it has function scope instead of block scope. Block scope is more concise, meaning we're not using var, we're using let, and block scope is the better choice. So always be aware of that. You might think it's harder using parameters and return statements in your functions, and using global variables might seem easier on top, but it's going to cause you a lot more problems down the road if you do that. So use parameters in your functions, use the return statement, and don't use global variables if you can stop it at all.